Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Panay. This podcast is a re-recording of my latest podcast, which was about A Course in Miracles and seeing its myth as a myth for our time, addressing the challenges and the opportunities available to us at this time in history. I've decided to re-record the episode because just as I started recording it originally, a house started to be demolished across the road, and I think you can really hear that in the background. I'll be reading from an essay I wrote called The Age of Communion, which addresses that major question of mine, and it is taken from my book, The Farthest Reaches of Inner Space, A Course in Miracles and the Postmodern World. So let's look at why we are experiencing this lifetime at this time in history and A Course in Miracles being available to us at this time in history. What's going on there? What might be the connection? So let's get stuck into the reading. The Age of Communion. One day, at some point in my late adolescence, I was walking down the hallway at home when a thought stopped me in my tracks. How are we supposed to live life? I stood still, arrested by the weight of the question. The Anthony Robbins goal setting, set your mind to it, no excuses kind of thinking was big at the time. But I was also well aware of Eastern traditions emphasising simplicity and receptivity, the goal being to move with the whole, the Tao, or God's will. Was I to decide who I wanted to be, where I wanted to go, or should I focus on opening myself to inner guidance, to being led in these regards? Time was of the essence when I asked this question. I needed to choose a course of study for university, so my rational brain kicked in and I decided, since I enjoyed art and science, to study architecture. In the first week I knew it wasn't for me, but didn't know what else to do. I endured the course for 18 months and clearly remember when I knew I had to drop out. I was sitting with a friend in the library discussing an assignment we each had to do. Looking at the assignment outline, I realised on a deep level that if I continued with the course, I was going to become ill. It was a wrong way, turn back moment, and the message was loud and clear. I can't do this assignment, I said to my friend. Responding as you'd expect a friend would, she gave me words of encouragement. Of course you can do it. Don't be silly. You've got this covered. Or words to that effect. No, you don't understand. I can't do this assignment. I can't do any of it anymore. Though I felt some anxiety over the implications of this realisation, I'd have to tell my parents I was dropping out, move back home, figure out what to do with my life. I also felt considerable relief knowing there was no viable option for me to stay, that my feat of endurance was over. Such is the experience of embarking on a path that doesn't suit you, as many of us do until we find a proper fit. The stress of deciding what to do with your life is linked to questions of identity. A growing acceptance of diversity and the importance of being authentic characterises today's Western society. This is perhaps currently most pronounced in relation to sexuality and gender identity, where the devastating effects of denying a fundamental aspect of who you are have been widely documented. Society hasn't always appreciated the uniqueness of individuals, however. It's been the product of a long process of social and historical development. The 18th century philosopher George Hegel suggested that human consciousness evolves as society develops over history. It can be helpful, therefore, to look at the social and historical changes that led to where we are today, locating some of our current challenges and values within a grander scheme of things. With this in mind, I'll explore how today's appreciation for both personal authenticity and spiritual transcendence arose out of the social and historical context of the medieval and modern eras, leading to where we stand in the postmodern world. Subtitle: A Place for Everything and Everything in its Place. Everyone had a place in medieval life, which created both safety and restriction. Society was arranged according to the clear hierarchy of the feudal system. At the top was the monarch, followed by lords and the clergy, leaving peasants to occupy the lowest strata of society. From childhood, you knew where you stood, the likely trajectory of your life, and what it was about. These things were provided by your position within a family, located amongst a small community, under the auspices of a lord, monarch, and the church. Life being so tightly contained, there was little room for pondering such existential questions as the one I asked myself as a teenager. Community, belonging, meaning, and security were the promise of medieval life, so long as you didn't challenge the status quo. I think of Socrates, the self-described gadfly of Athens, and how his work to liberate people from the irrational nature of many of their beliefs, values, and assumptions got him in trouble with the powers that be. It can be a dangerous endeavour, but our capacity for reason can't be stifled indefinitely. Humans are naturally curious creatures that want to know how things tick on many levels. And so, when the 14th century saw a rebirth, a renaissance, of philosophy, science, technology, and art from classical Greece and Italy, Europe experienced an explosion of interest in these areas. It wasn't long before people relied on science rather than religion to explain physical phenomena. The modern era, with its emphasis on rationality, was on the horizon, as was a new respect for the individual. Subtitle: The Mind on Fire. The 16th century is generally regarded as the beginning of the modern era, and we can see a reflection of the spirit of the time in the Protestant Reformation movement begun by the German Catholic monk Martin Luther. The first commercial printing press had been invented in Germany, providing for a wider dissemination of ideas than ever before. Luther made good use of this opportunity and translated the Bible into German from the original Greek and Hebrew. Using the everyday language of the common person was part of Luther's strategy, as he tried to de-emphasize church dogma, which he maintained didn't always have a scriptural basis. Luther had seen that dogma was being used for unspiritual reasons, for power and coercion. Rather than relying on clergy to relay the Bible's message, Luther encouraged people to read the Bible and contemplate its message directly. And people were ready for this opportunity. Luther's translation repeatedly sold out. That everyone, not just trained pastors, could study the Bible was a democratic ideal. It meant that there was no hierarchy to rely on for access to the Bible's message. No middlemen, no gatekeepers. Luther emphasised that we have a direct relationship with God, that God's message can reach us through our own private conscience if we make time for contemplation. This idea of a one-to-one correspondence involving personal insight can be seen as a foundation of modern individualism. Luther was also a vocal advocate for the general education of children, boys and girls alike. He bolstered the growing emphasis on the individual as a reasoning being with the right and ability to think critically. He also knew that with the ability to read came a greater opportunity for self-reflection. The hold of church dogma and superstition continued to decline as scientific discoveries became more widely accepted, reflecting a philosophical shift towards empiricism that marked the 17th century Age of Reason. Now, just as an aside, empiricism means what you can observe through your senses. It means taking careful note of cause and effect relationships that you see outside in the world. So it's that scientific eye with which you look. It's the opposite of relying on superstition to understand why things happen. Carrying on. Ideas centred on human happiness in the here and now, rather than religious salvation in an afterlife, and values such as liberty, equality, and religious tolerance paved the way for the French Revolution in 1789. Running alongside this period of momentous social change was the Industrial Revolution. The discovery of a wealth of coal reserves in Great Britain, along with the development of steam engines and machinery, led to mass production of goods and the establishment of factories and centralised industrial towns. Small rural communities were no longer the hub of commerce. People moved to the city for employment, and so were away from their primary identity as part of a family unit. The individual was now more or less left to their own devices to make their way in the world. The corollary to this was that they could define themselves, shape their own identity. The self-made individual emerged as the new hero. The suffering servant ideal of the religious order, promising happiness in an afterlife, had been somewhat superseded. But with the growth of freedom came the question of belonging. In medieval times, people were part of a larger whole that gave them context and meaning. Everyone had a place. It might be a difficult, lowly place, but it offered some security in its own limiting way. Subtitle: Each to their own. Freedoms gained often meant a weakening of community ties and commonly held religious beliefs. And yet, in many respects, the world was getting smaller. The middle of the 19th century saw the laying of telegraph cables and train lines, the use of steamships for travel and trade. People from different countries, products and customs from different lands could mingle and collide, with distance no longer a barrier. As textiles, dyes and spices from the East became popular commodities for trade, Indian and Chinese religious scriptures also appealed to a growing Western appetite for the exotic. Eastern spiritual texts heavily influenced the 19th century transcendentalist movement in New England in the US. The transcendentalists sought to achieve a balance between rationality and insight through transcendent spiritual experience. They also emphasised the importance of liberty and independent thinking so as not to be misled by a corrupt society. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller were some of the most famous transcendentalists. Emerson for essays such as Self-Reliance, Thoreau for Walden, a book about his 2 years alone in a cabin in the woods, and Fuller for her pioneering work on women's rights and the abolition of slavery. Fuller's work is particularly interesting in light of our current conceptualization of gender. The following extract from Fuller's Woman in the 19th Century, written nearly 180 years ago, would fit just as well in a contemporary piece and foreshadows psychologist Carl Jung's idea that every person is a psychological hybrid of what we've categorised as masculine and feminine. Quote, "Male and female represent the two sides of the great radical dualism, but, in fact, they are perpetually passing into one another. Fluid hardens to solid. Solid rushes to fluid. There is no wholly masculine man, no purely feminine woman." End of quote. Let everyone develop all aspects of their being. Let them be who they are. This was the general message of the transcendentalists. They were about being true to yourself as an individual and in accordance with the guidance of a transcendent divinity. As Fuller wrote, let a person do what they feel to do, quote, from divine command and not from man's tradition, end of quote. This movement, along with the work of Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard in continental Europe around the same time, ushered in the modern concept of authenticity, which can be traced back to Aristotle. Authenticity is concerned with the purpose of our actions, with doing something for its own sake, rather than for the prospect of reward. To Aristotle, when ulterior motives such as praise, status, or acceptance are our primary guiding force, we're not truly the author of our actions. The values and opinions of others are. The spiritual focus of the New England Transcendentalists was mirrored half the world away in the European Romantic movement, which began in response to the elevated status of science and rationality. Like the Transcendentalists, the Romantics emphasised the importance of intuition, spirituality, and mysticism. The modern era therefore allowed for the expression of two opposite but complementary voices, one representing reason, the other mystery and enchantment. Following this coexistence came the emergence of a new field of endeavour, blending the deep interiority of Romanticism with the extra version of scientific rationalism. That field was psychoanalysis. Subtitle: The Rise of Personal Life. The mid-19th century saw a rise in systematic experimental measurement of psychological processes such as short and long-term memory, sensation, and perception. The German physiologist Wilhelm Wundt is famous for distinguishing psychology as a science apart from philosophy, marking it as an independent field of study and one often followed via medicine. Enter Sigmund Freud, the doctor-turned-psychologist who, at the turn of the century, published his pivotal book on psychology, The Interpretation of Dreams. Freud was interested in what motivates our behaviour and suggested that the answer lay in a part of the mind called the unconscious. Dynamic internal conflict was a term he coined to describe the inner tension between unconscious impulses and something in us that says, "Oh no, you don't." This conflict, said Freud, is the source of anxiety and other psychological symptoms. Freud helped his patients begin a process of self-inquiry. What did they really feel about certain people, events, their childhood? Every person had a unique history and equally unique way of dealing with associated inner conflicts. In his book, Secrets of the Soul, A Social and Cultural History of Psychoanalysis, the sociologist Eli Zareski suggests that psychoanalysis was the first grand theory and practice of personal life. Zareski describes personal life as the experience of having an identity distinct from your place in the family, in society, and in the workforce. Psychoanalysis, says Zareski, helped to free individuals from unconscious images of familial authority and associated internal conflicts, allowing them to realise a sense of freedom and autonomy. The idea of personal freedom spread in the 1960s, a time when people looked with unprecedented criticism at the values of the past. There was a refusal to take the aggressive striving, ambition and push of the modern era seriously, along with the strict gender roles and stereotypes. This ushered in the postmodern era, and we can see an extension of the idea of personal life in the sexual revolution of the 60s and the hippie movement of the 70s. Continuing the theme of self-discovery was a new branch of psychology called humanistic psychology. The idea of an authentic personality is central to humanistic psychology, and self-actualization is the term used to describe the process of giving voice to it. Humanistic psychologists recognise that apart from the motivations for behaviour put forward by Freud, such as to avoid pain and experience pleasure, we are also motivated by a constructive force that moves us to realise who we are. This follows directly on the heels of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, which suggests we are all unique in our blend of temperaments, preferences, and other innate qualities. And if something helps express our true character, it also contributes to our well-being. The link between authenticity and well-being reminds me of an interview I saw many years ago with the renowned Australian chef Kylie Kwong. Kylie was an extremely shy child, but when she discovered her love of cooking, she experienced a tremendous growth in her self-confidence. Watching her now on various cooking programs, it's hard to imagine she ever suffered the uncertainty she did in her early years. In the kitchen, her happy place, she shines. I think of being authentic like wearing shoes that fit well. When the shoe fits, it doesn't cause you any pain, and so your attention isn't drawn to your feet. Ill-fitting shoes, however, make you acutely aware of every step you take. Likewise, when we're not being true to who we are, it hurts, and we become more self-conscious and unsure of ourselves. This is expressed succinctly in the Taoist saying, "When the shoe fits, the foot is forgotten." Many humanistic psychologists were also interested in Eastern religions such as Zen Buddhism. Like the Transcendentalists, these psychologists entertained the Eastern concept of enlightenment, of tapping into a level of consciousness beyond the ego, or individual personality. Subtitle: The Human Potential Movement. Off the back of humanistic psychology came the human potential movement of the 60s and 70s, first emerging in California. An eclectic mix of psychologists, writers, artists, and spiritual seekers became interested in exploring the potential of human consciousness. How far could we go? Getting in touch with our feelings was deemed a starting point. Encounter groups help people do this by encouraging members to speak frankly to and about each other. Things could get heated, but it was all in the name of bringing emotions to the fore. The mind-body connection also came to be appreciated in a very big way and led to the emergence of bodywork and movement therapies such as Rolfing and Feldenkrais. A mindful approach to your body's responses to situations and of habitual ways of moving could enhance your awareness of emotional states and patterns. I remember a comment from a teacher during my Rolfing training. She said, "The way you move across the room is how you move through life." And with that, the entire class suddenly straightened up. Adding to these alternative forms of bodywork and movement therapies was, of course, a growing interest in yoga. The human potential movement gained a large following, and in 1972, a book exploring the frontiers of research and thought in that area called The Highest State of Consciousness was published. Edited by John White, it includes, amongst others, essays on Zen Buddhism, LSD and mysticism, visionary experience, and the Tao Te Ching. It's an eclectic mix of material. People were clearly looking far and wide for inspiration. Completed in the same year as this book and published 4 years later, A Course in Miracles, a psycho-spiritual training curriculum comprising a text, workbook and manual, entered the scene and quickly rose in popularity. The human potential movement was about releasing barriers to expressing your authentic self and allowing your consciousness to expand beyond the usual bounds of perception. The curriculum of the course addressed these needs in a way that drew on the psychological insights of the modern era and followed the historical trend of turning inward for answers. As Helen Schuckman wrote about the course in its preface, its only purpose is to provide a way in which some people will find their own internal teacher. Following in the psychoanalytic tradition, A Course in Miracles aims to help people become aware of unconscious conflicts. These conflicts sabotage our best efforts to lead a more peaceful existence and, according to the Course, invariably stem from shame and guilt associated with a belief in separation from God, an all-encompassing love and source of security. The Course uses psychological concepts such as repression, projection, displacement, and dissociation to show how we defend ourselves from shame and guilt. Reflecting Carl Jung's emphasis on our tendency to project disowned aspects of ourselves, it puts forward a process of forgiveness in which we realise that the way we see others is the way we see ourselves. And here's a quote from the preface of A Course in Miracles. As we learn to recognise our perceptual errors, we also learn to look past them or forgive. At the same time, we are forgiving ourselves, looking past our distorted self-concepts to the self that God created in us and as us. End of quote. And that self is spelt with a capital S to differentiate it from the ego self that we think we are. So the capital S self is the spiritual self. The postmodern era in the West, then, is one that moves us toward embodying who we are on both a personal and transcendent level. Though the decline of religious authority and of a fixed place within a tight-knit community has thrown us back upon ourselves, it has directed us toward the ultimate source of communion, meaning, and freedom, our own mind. This has been vital to locating answers within ourselves instead of relying on external authorities. Margaret Fuller quotes a woman in her book whose words, though they focus on the experience of women in her time, apply to everyone. Quote, "Though I might be aided and instructed by others, I must depend on myself as the only constant friend. This self-dependence is deprecated as a fault in most women. They are taught to learn their rule from without, not to unfold it from within. End of quote. And I do think that when Margaret Fuller says, or the person she quoted says, I must depend on myself as the only constant friend, that is like what the Course means in its section called the appointed friend, when it talks about Jesus or the Holy Spirit being the friend appointed to us by God to help us learn our lessons of forgiveness. As it says in the Course, the appointed friend is our only friend. And what it means by that is if we are not connected with Jesus or the Holy Spirit and their loving presence within our mind, we will be connected with the ego. And if we are connected and identified with the ego and its thought system of separation and competition, no one will be our friend in our mind because we'll feel ourselves at odds with them. And just as the Holy Spirit or Jesus can help us get in touch with the self that is us without the shame and guilt, therefore the self that we are innately in terms of our personality as well as our spiritual self. This quote from the person that Margaret Fuller is talking about shows a similar recognition. Carrying on, we can be taught by others, but our conclusions are our responsibility. And in accepting this, we turn inward for guidance. It's this turning inwards that connects us with our truest self in terms of our innate personality and transcendent spiritual self. They are both within the same territory, the farthest reaches of inner space. And that is the end of the essay. Thanks for listening. Tune in again. Bye.